The play on words is not evident unless one looks into it, but there is obviously a deliberate use of the expression Baryona here. It is in parallel to what has just been declared regarding the Son of God, and here we have the son of Jonah, Baryona. It actually in Hebrew would correspond to son of the dove, and that also has been picked up by commentators, that there is here this inspiration already coming in, that he's not speaking just from the flesh, and this is going to be also his role through the centuries. In the early centuries, notably in the whole complex area of working out the relationship between the divine persons, the whole question of nature, person, substance, all that goes with understanding what we cannot understand humanly, the whole church worked through the Holy Spirit, but very much aware that this promise was given to Peter. This does come through in the early councils, that there was an awareness on the part of the patriarchs in the whole of the world that Peter had to be there. And when something came from Rome, people would actually sit up. Peter has spoken. That might actually be the case even if the Pope in Rome could not be present at an ecumenical council himself physically, or at some synod where things were being thrashed out. He would be sending delegates. We have this in the case of Leo the Great, the Leonine letters coming through and having a great power of influence. We forget how complex the whole area was, and we had things splitting off even at an early stage. The whole block that did not accept what was being defined as Chalcedon or Chalcedon. Then we had this Chalcedonian church, which was thought to be monophysite, one nature, monophysis, and then which years later was brought in, and often one saw as time went on that actually they weren't saying something very different. Quite a few blocks were healed, especially in recent centuries, and when this happens we have an interesting phenomenon coming into play. We have blocks which broke off from unity with Rome, coming back with all their precious baggage, uncontaminated. It was the great wish of John Paul II and Benedict XVI that this should be healed. John Paul II was hoping that something would happen by the turn of the millennium, as at more or less the turn of the first millennium it was lost. It was time, as he put it, for the church to breathe again with its two lungs. Remember how already he made the apostles of the Slavs, Cyril and Methodius, co-patrons of Europe. He, coming from the Eastern Bloc, was aware of their importance. Benedict XVI did actually draw up a model for union. He had hoped that it would be picked up, and he, with his great theological awareness, was fully aware of all the theological problems and therefore the thorny issues which would upset the East, and also all the questions relating to authority. The East functions on the basis of autocephalous churches, auto itself and kephalos the head. They have heads, patriarchs, and these have a certain measure of independence, but they are in communion with each other. And of course that communion was always there with Peter until the terrible break of 1054. But what we forget is that it was presumed that it would be healed fairly quickly, because things often were explosive in those centuries, but they came back, as in rather a bad marriage in our own day, just another bust-up. But unfortunately it was not to be the case, not yet anyway. An interesting thing happened under extreme duress when the East was in danger of collapsing politically. It was in the 30s, 40s, 50s of the 1400s when the force of Islam was such that they realized that the very center of the East was going to collapse if they didn't get help. And so they thought, what can we do? The only possible help that we can really get must come from the West. But there's no way that the West will actually come on board unless the West is respected for what they claim to be. This would be their mind. And so they did send bishops to try and heal this terrible state of affairs. The result was the Council of Ferrara, which then re-met in Florence in 1439, and did actually succeed in drawing up probably something very similar to what Benedict did recently before he retired, proposing a model of union between East and West. It was on paper and it was an ecumenical council, but of course, given the mindset of great blocks of the East, it was not accepted. And so we have that rejection when it went back to grassroots level. And so we're still stuck there. And all the West in the meantime could do would recuperate individual blocks, what we call the uniates, those who have an Eastern rite but now accept the authority of Rome. What the East respects secretly with regard to the West is the fact that when compared with their situation, we are true to the ancient word Catholic, because wherever a Catholic goes, he doesn't ask whether he's a Greek Catholic, a Ukrainian Catholic, a Russian Catholic. He just says, "Are you a Catholic?" Whereas they are very much aware of the national element in their churches, and it's a bit difficult sometimes for them to insert themselves just like that in another church, even though it might be Orthodox, because the national thing is important, and therefore it's not quite so simple. And therefore they would admire and envy secretly the way that a Catholic can really go anywhere on this planet and feel at home. With regard to the consequences, unfortunately, we tend to forget all that block fairly easily because we're not exposed to it, and we tend to think far more of those who are close to us, those who have come out of us, Protestants. And therefore, when in dialogue and prayer with other Christians, it's to them that we look and like them that we think. And then something strange happens. If one lives in a country of mixed cultures like England or Wales, where one engages in the ecumenical dialogue, what one finds after a while is that this goes on. One engages in a mental game. One uses a word in ecumenical dialogue, which in our theology means one thing, but in theirs means quite another one. One doesn't go into the problem, one just uses the word, but all the time one is playing a double game. It happens on several levels, from the prayer meeting to the meeting between experts, even ending in documents of agreement, so-called. Passing through all the levels in between, the cup of coffee, the chat with our Protestant brethren, in which the same double game is going on. It's actually, over a period of years, something which causes confusion mentally. And it's something which has occurred to me, reflecting on how things happened way back in the 90s, and how things could have happened in different points in between, being ordained in Wales and going towards Wales or whatever, how actually, looking back, there is a providence in things which meant that the only way that one can actually give one's life to proclaiming the truth without having to play this double game is in a Catholic situation, rather than in a situation where if one speaks the language, notably Welsh, doing so means having always to play the double game, because nearly everyone who speaks Welsh is a Protestant, therefore always until death playing a double game, and never ever being able freely to proclaim the truth. So there's a providence and a wisdom sometimes at work which when we're young we can't see. And it hit me just recently when finding bits of things I'd written way back in novitiate years in the early 90s in Ireland, how actually this had come through. I'd nearly forgotten it. It was a little child. She was about 8 at the time, and she thought that all children had the same gift. She heard the Lord's voice, sometimes Our Lady. And it was quite objective. It was not just a fantasy, because we were able to ask questions sometimes through her family, and it was very interesting the things that would come out. And when the family wanted to ask 1 or 2 questions in my case, immediately things came out. He must be a priest, and this question immediately, he must be in Ireland. And then more questions were asked, where? And this was coming out of nowhere. I remember a child of 8 had no idea. More to the east. Then they were pursuing it again. More to the east of Kilnacrot, or where we're speaking now. More to the east of Kilnacrot. And actually that's what happened, because Drogheda is more to the east of Kilnacrot, but years later it happened. But this one was interesting. Ireland. It hit me strongly, precisely going, because I had a helmet here from Italy, going to where St. Patrick is buried, which she wanted to visit. There, how precisely a Welshman was brought to Ireland. So the Lord is actually asking us sometimes not to be attached to anything but Him, and to let Him guide our feet as He guided these people who could have been lost in history with their fishing nets. But He had a project. Why? Because He chose people who weren't full of themselves, or if they were very quickly brought to where they were, nothing. And then He was free to act. So I leave it with you. It's that same wisdom which from these poor fishermen, in the case of Paul, someone of great culture but an enemy of the church, was able to convert great chunks of humanity. He can do the same if we let Him and don't get in the way. Priesthood. To be all thine, my God, to be all thine, and to stand where the feet of thine have stood, since Christendom, with ancient wording fine, first set apart the race that hath withstood the turnings of a world, to hold the hand that holds the all of all. 'Twould be the blessed and hallowed holding of empowered command that ne'er an angel held at His behest. 'Twould be, my Lord, a little thing for Thee to whisper for a whisper, for herein, within a little nod, rocks all to be or not to be, set loose by one sound's din. Yet I know that were I given a word, a melody of mercy could be heard.